In this video, you're going to get a chapter-by-chapter summary of Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Hi, my name is Jeremy, and welcome to Elwin Studios. There are 45 chapters, so we're gonna go kinda fast. Chapter 1 introduces Uncle Tom's master, Mr. Shelby, talking to a slave trader about selling Uncle Tom to settle a debt. But the trader wants more, so he also buys Harry, a 4-year-old boy. But Eliza, the boy's mother, overhears a bit of the conversation and starts worrying. Chapter 2 and 3 introduce Eliza's husband, George Harris. George is the slave of a cruel master who took George from his job simply because George was obviously smarter, better, and more manly than his master. George tells Eliza that he plans to escape to Canada, where he can actually be paid for his work, and so he can buy his family's freedom. Eliza tells George to wait, but George's master is about to make him marry another woman, or else be sold south. We hit the pause button on that story and go back to Uncle Tom. In chapter 4, he's probably in his late 40s, and he is now in his cabin with his wife, 2 boys, and a baby girl. This chapter is all about the relationships that Uncle Tom has with his family, friends, and his master. Remember, we found out at the very start of the book that Uncle Tom is going to be sold. But right now, we look at Tom's leadership position as well as his sort of pastoral position on the plantation. He's the one everyone looks up to, and everyone includes Mr. Shelby's son, George. Yes, Stowe uses the same name for different people several times. But anyway, George Shelby is one of Uncle Tom's best friends. George teaches Uncle Tom how to read, and Uncle Tom teaches George things from the Bible while George reads to him. It's a heartwarming scene in chapter 4 that all comes crashing down. So, chapter 5. No one prior to this chapter knows that the Shelbys are in debt, but ears have walls, and Eliza overhears Mr. Shelby telling Emily, his wife, about the whole thing. Eliza is Emily's favorite slave, and of course she's against selling Harry, but the papers are already signed. Eliza packs some things, takes Harry, and runs to Uncle Tom's cabin. She tells him everything she heard, but he knows that if he runs with Eliza and Harry, his own children and the rest of the family would probably be sold to pay the debt in his stead. Uncle Tom is such a valuable slave, Mr. Shelby even said it's either him or the house. The next 3 chapters, 6, 7, and 8, are almost all about Eliza's escape from Mr. Haley, the slave trader. It's a super famous story of how she ran across a half-frozen river and Mr. Haley had to hire someone else to go after her. But chapter 9 is an interesting one because when Eliza crosses the Ohio River into the Free States, you would think that Stowe would give her a break. But no, the new fugitive slave law is just passed and she has to keep running. The first house that she goes to is that of a senator who is in favor of the new law. But after hearing about how Harry was going to be taken from her, the senator and his family try to help in any way they can. The family had just lost a boy about Harry's age, and their eyes were now open to the horrors of slavery. We switch back here to Uncle Tom in chapter 10. He says his goodbyes and Mr. Haley takes him away. George's goodbye is especially interesting because he promises to buy Tom back when he can. Chapter 11. Remember George, like Eliza's husband, George Harris? He is on the run as well. But unlike Eliza, he has weeks to plan ahead. Somewhere in Kentucky, we meet a couple people who are talking about how slaves ought to be treated and why slaves run away. And George Harris walks in, disguised as a Spanish rich guy with a slave. One of the guys in the bar is George's old employer, who recognizes George. But they get to talking about why George is running, and Mr. Wilson, his employer, ends up giving him a bunch of money to help him with his escape. An iconic line in this chapter is when Mr. Wilson is like, I'm paraphrasing here, "Isn't God's will for you to be a slave if that's the situation you're in?" And George, who talks a lot, is like, if you were kidnapped and tortured, would you call that God's will? Or would God's will look more like the first chance you have to escape? They have this discussion about liberty and the importance of education, family, and faith, and a lot of other stuff. It's an interesting chapter. Back again to Uncle Tom. Mr. Haley is taking him to New Orleans. This chapter is basically a bunch of side quests to further Stowe's argument against slavery. Mr. Haley goes to an auction where we see an old lady separated from her son. Then on the riverboat, everyone is talking. A bunch of the passengers have this discussion about whether slavery is biblical or not. Then there's this woman who drowns herself and her baby because Mr. Haley tells her that her baby is going to be sold. It's a lot of little stories that aren't really about Uncle Tom, but Uncle Tom is a side character in all of them. Chapter 13 takes us once again back to Eliza at the Halliday Home. The Hallidays are like the epitome of goodness in the book. They're Quakers in a Quaker town. They let Eliza rest, look after Harry, and even find George and bring him to them, so that the whole Harris family is back together again. I want to pause here because George has another iconic conversation, this time with Simeon Halliday, about the risk he is taking to help. George is like, again, paraphrasing, "I hope you don't get into trouble for helping us." And Mr. Halliday is like, "I didn't do it for you. I did it for God." Chapter 14, 15, and 16. Uncle Tom is heading south on a riverboat. He meets a little girl and is bought by the girl's family, the St. Clares. Eva, the little girl, is described in the book as basically an angel. Her dad has a weird, sarcastic, rich gentleman, sad boy kind of thing going, but then there's the cousin, who's described multiple times as square. Then there's the wife, Marie. She can be described as the "can I have your manager" lady. Uncle Tom kind of just does his own thing in the background while the St. Clair family plays out the classic sitcom thing, but with slavery. And we break once again and go back to George and Eliza and Harry. With the help of the Hallidays, they go to the next stop, but along the way, slave hunters catch up to them, and they climb up this hill, and George gives his liberty or death speech. Then they fight the slave hunters and get away once again, because George has a gun. But the Harrises do take one of the wounded hunters to the next town, because his buddies ditched him. Chapter 18 to 20 are mostly about Miss Ophelia, the super square cousin in the family. She's a northerner and thinks everyone in New Orleans is a heathen for owning slaves. She talks to her cousin about how bad the system is and how bad he is for having slaves himself. So he gives her a slave to properly bring up. Chapter 21 is about Uncle Tom's wife getting a letter from him. She, Mrs. Shelby, and George Shelby make plans to raise money for Uncle Tom to be bought back. Chapter 22 to 30 go from the best of times to the worst of times. Eva, the little girl that bought Uncle Tom, dies, but her father promised to bring Uncle Tom back to his family to freedom. But he also dies, so the family is left with Marie, the self-absorbed rich lady who thinks no one understands her own suffering. Things are about to get really bad for all of the slaves, including Uncle Tom. Marie decides to sell everyone and everything and go back to live with her parents. All the slaves get taken to the auction, and Uncle Tom is sold to a man named Simon Legree. Chapter 30 to 36 is about how Uncle Tom survives on the worst plantation known to man. Legree is the kind of master who would rather buy slaves whenever they got old or sick, and he would rather do that than let his current slaves have lunch breaks, or even have more than one set of clothes. Another stellar conversation comes out of these chapters when Legree tells Uncle Tom to beat one of the sicker slaves for being lazy. Uncle Tom flat out refuses in front of everyone on the plantation. So Legree starts beating him, saying that the Bible says slaves ought to obey their masters, and that he bought Uncle Tom for $1,200, and that Uncle Tom was his body and soul. Here, Tom finally brings all the readers to this mind-blowing realization when he stands up straight, looks up with a smile, and is like, "Nah, you don't own my soul. God owns my soul." The mic drops, and Legree and everyone is in shock, because in the face of all the worst of circumstances, Uncle Tom is smiling because he still has heaven and he still has hope. Legree has Uncle Tom beaten again and again, and while all this happens, Tom is still the best worker on the property. He still encourages all the other slaves not to give up. We go back, yet again, to George and Eliza and Harry, as they disguise themselves and cross into Canada, where George, who had been wrestling with Christianity for years, finally worships God. This is contrasted to Uncle Tom in the previous chapters, when in the face of all suffering, he could still believe in a good God. Chapter 37 to 42, Uncle Tom continues to help the slaves. One particular slave who had an especially sad backstory, which is very long and complicated, tries to kill Legree, but Uncle Tom stops her and says she should probably run away instead. Her name is Cassie. She and another slave do escape, but Uncle Tom is beaten for information on how to find them. This time, Legree doesn't hold back at all, but Uncle Tom is hanging by a thread. This display of sacrifice turns the hearts of Legree's right-hand men, and they try to revive Uncle Tom. But it's too late. But as Uncle Tom is on his deathbed, who is to ride up but young Master George Shelby? George sees how Uncle Tom is as happy as can be, even at his death, and after burying Uncle Tom, he goes back home. But on his way, he meets Cassie, and together the two meet Emily. Chapter 43. The three of them travel north, and everyone is reunited with their families, including Cassie, who we find out is Eliza's mother. Okay, The 44th chapter is sort of a final chapter when young Master George Shelby goes back to his plantation and frees all his slaves, including Uncle Tom's wife and his kids. But he rehires everyone and tells them that he wants them to stay on the plantation and work for him. George reminds everyone that it is because of Uncle Tom's influence that they are free. And every time they look at Uncle Tom's cabin, they should remember him and the freedom they have. I know I said there were 45 chapters. The last chapter is just a bunch of fact-checking. Harriet Beecher Stowe was very careful in making everything accurate to history as possible. Everything that happened to our fictional characters actually happened to real people in real life. Stowe just changed some of the names, dates, and places. If you learned something new about this video, you can click here for more brain-stimulating stuff, and over here to subscribe to stay up to date on all we got going on.